Welcome, everyone. We're especially pleased to be able to offer this webinar today. Thank you for joining us, especially welcome to Mayor Kate Stewart, council members, and city staff. Takoma Stormwater Solutions hopes to begin an exploration of the stormwater issue in Takoma Park. Next slide. So who are we? Takoma Stormwater Solutions began meeting a little over a year ago. A number of our members have deep backgrounds in stormwater policy issues, planning, landscape architecture. We meet weekly on Monday evenings. Newcomers are welcome. We, starting last fall, began a Stormwater Survey that we hope to report on today, or will report on today. We are members of the Regional Stormwater Partners Network, and we've also begun thinking about a framework to help the city think about how to address stormwater issues. Our website is there on that slide. We will have a slide at the very end that has that information again, as well as some additional contact information. Next. Takoma Stormwater Solutions is a member of Climate Action Coffee, which itself is a part of the Takoma Park mobilization. The Climate Action Coffee has been meeting since October of 2019. I think virtually every Wednesday, except maybe one that landed on Christmas Day. We've been addressing a range of issues: food security, food waste, financing. We've had a couple forums on the climate action plan at the county level. We've also hosted a candidate forum, and we will likely continue to do those sorts of things. This is yet another one of our subgroups is hosting this one today. Other groups focus on pollinators and native habitat, and we have a new group that started in February that's exploring the opportunities for creating food forests throughout Takoma Park. Next. So today we hope to present our findings from our survey and other explorations of the studies that have been done. We want to present our understanding of what we're facing, particularly as climate change continues to unfold, and to highlight our vulnerability to flooding and other issues, and then finally to suggest how we can continue to collaborate between the city, staff, and residents. Note that all of the photos that we're showing were taken in Takoma Park. Also, while we're glad to have Kate here, she is needing to go to another event at 1, so she said she will stay as long as possible, but you don't see her at the end because she's our mayor and has other duties. So we're grateful for whatever time she can share with us today. Next, we want to show a 5-minute video of the stormwater issues.
On September 10th, 2020, the flooded Sligo Creek overwhelmed its intersection with New Hampshire Avenue, completely stopping traffic for hours. This got a lot of attention. But what happened upstream of New Hampshire Avenue and uphill of Sligo Creek that was very painfully noticed by individual Takoma Park residents and very much in need of significant and expert investigation? During the heavy rainfall, stormwater runoff poured down from higher elevations, flooding homes at lower elevations. The quantity of stormwater runoff was so great it literally blew open this basement door. Lower elevation property represents a challenge for the city because this type of flooding will happen again elsewhere in the future. A neighbor on the same street shared this view of his basement, with the stoic comment that he now had motivation to clean up his basement. These two homes are in the same sub-watershed called Bashir's Run, a group of streams that are now buried in underground pipes. These pipes all converge in the area of the library and community center, and from there flow into Sligo Creek. When the buried pipes fill up with stormwater runoff during heavy rainstorms, the runoff backs up into the streets, which cause street flooding. Here's another hot spot for flooding in Takoma Park, near another tributary of Sligo Creek called Takoma Branch, near Elm Avenue. Even though the September 10th flooding in Takoma Park got so little city attention, it should be an opportunity to learn how to address the increasing intensity of stormwater runoff in Takoma Park. The Elm Avenue homeowner notes that in spite of massive flooding from the street, his property is protected from damage because of landscape swales in his backyard that absorb some of the stormwater while also carrying off excess stormwater runoff away from his property. He's one of the very few fortunate city residents who can drain off stormwater to a stormwater management pond downhill from the house. The stormwater management pond is on city property and was built using stormwater funds. This is one example where city intervention helps property owners. Other such opportunities need to be explored ASAP. The flooding on our streets is legendary and becoming more damaging and dangerous. Not only is there flooding from the rising of inundated streams, but excessive stormwater runoff from higher elevations is causing flooding far from our streams. Poplar Avenue down the hill from Tacoma Junction is one of the most visibly threatened areas. Wherever there is not adequate stormwater management, the situation can be ugly. Here, downhill from the Tacoma Metro Station parking lot, stormwater runoff often flows onto nearby homeowner property and from there spills onto adjacent properties. This is happening all over Takoma Park today, as the Tacoma Stormwater Solution Survey demonstrates. Stormwater runoff flowing between neighbors' properties is a very significant problem. The damage from this cross-property flow can be significant, as we saw dramatically during the September 10th storm. Takoma Park is responsible for managing its stormwater runoff. With comprehensive and expert planning, these flooding situations can be remedied, but it will take a number of years. There are examples of communities who have used their stormwater funds to both comply with federal regulations, positively contribute to climate change challenges, and improve their community quality of life. Stormwater doesn't respect property lines, so we need to work together as residents and the city to develop a strategic plan to solve this problem comprehensively for everyone.
Thank you. Before I turn it over to Kate, I also would like to recognize specifically Jarrett Smith, Cindy DeBala, Peter Kovar, and State Delegate Al Carr. So Mayor, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Phil. So I just wanted to say a few words and thank everyone for all the work you're doing. This is invaluable to the city and to residents as we look for ways to work together to solve these issues. Stormwater mitigation is one of the impacts of climate change that we need to make sure we're addressing in our community to ensure that we are resilient moving into the future. As all of you know, was noted in the video, the city is in charge of its own stormwater program, independent of the county. We have a pretty robust program of maintenance and stormwater improvements and treatment in the city, and our program has really focused on public right-of-way and public areas. And we've received regional attention through this and the advances we've been able to make on stormwater, our stormwater program, through the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, the Local Government Advisory Committee, and the Alliance for the Bay are all groups that have recognized the work we've done in the city on stormwater. Most recently, I think folks will know the Flower Avenue Green Street project, which was unique in its collaboration with utility companies, as well as pulling together funding from the county, state, and environmental grants that really looked at addressing multiple issues in one project, and stormwater really being a cornerstone of that. The city has currently met what are now the current state required treatment levels for our stormwater permit. This hasn't been easy over the years, but there's been a real commitment in the city to address stormwater, particularly on our public right-of-ways. We can see our stormwater fee at work here in our community through new treatment facilities, innovations, and the installation of facilities around the community. I know our Director of Public Works had created a map a number of years ago. Actually, I think it was Councilmember Smith, who's on the phone call, who convened a meeting of regional leaders to take them around and look at our stormwater facilities in our community. One example of the things that we are able to do in the city that the county does not do is that we have the ability to actually inspect each pipe and inlet every 5 years. And so the city has been broken up into 5 sub areas, and we have a contractor who comes in and looks at 1/5 of the system each year. And that's in-depth information that help guides our repair list for the future. And so that's something we're able to do here in the city that the county does not do for its program. Moving forward, many of the things that we've talked about on the city council is really expanding our program and doing the work that you all have been talking about, which is looking at how we can do more to partner with private residences to really address stormwater issues. There's been some projects that were recently done on Sycamore, and a public works department is working on a project on Cockrell soon. But these are projects that need a lot more cooperation and pulling people together. And so I am so glad that all of you have dedicated your time, expertise, and connections in the community to pull together the vital information that we need to share it with everyone today, and to look for ways that we can partner together in the future. So I just want to say thank you again for all this work, and I look forward to listening today and working with you all in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate. Next slide. Over the next half hour, we're going to kind of give you a tour of what we've been experiencing here in the city, what we can anticipate. I think back up one slide, Rob, and make recommendations about our need to, plan and accelerate mitigation and adaptation efforts. So our first speaker is Paul Krasowski. Welcome, Paul.
Hi, I'm Paul Krasowski. I'm a longtime resident of Takoma Park. For those of you who don't know me, I have a doctorate in environmental engineering and science and about 40 years of experience in environmental consulting and water-related issues. In addition to that, I've served 6 years on the County Energy and Air Quality Advisory Committee, 6 years on the Takoma Park Environmental Committee, and I'm currently serving on the board of Friends of Sligo Creek. So what I want to give you in my little section here is some information about the science of stormwater in Takoma Park. Next slide, please. Now, I think as we all know, Takoma Park has experienced severe flooding in the past, and people have incurred substantial costs to respond to this. Right now, however, the response by residents and the city government has been piecemeal and reactive rather than holistic, strategic, and proactive. Due to climate change, we're expecting we have to have a different new normal, as people say, a different way of looking at stormwater. Because climate scientists and regulatory agencies expect both the incidence and severity of flooding to increase due to climate change. What this really means is that strategic and integrative policies and planning are needed to adapt to increased flooding and ensure public safety and welfare in the future for Takoma Park. Next slide. An independent study that was performed by a flood factor analysis shows that in Takoma Park, 477 properties have a greater than 26% chance of being severely affected by flooding over the next 30 years. This study, you should remember, includes only a moderate impact of climate change and only a 30-year period. If some of the worst forecasts for climate change actually occur, and in the longer time period, this number could increase greatly. Next slide, please. Now, in Takoma Park, we have not been inactive on this. In fact, going back to the year 2000, the Committee on the Environment produced a local action plan for reducing greenhouse gas emissions that brought attention to the climate flooding issue. Since that time, many other things, including studies, task forces, and investigations have occurred, concluding with one just recently this year, a presentation by a PhD candidate from George Mason University on how to prioritize stormwater infrastructure projects under a changing climate in Takoma Park. So now we have all this information, and really there are a lot of other studies that are also relevant, but it's time to adapt to climate change and put all this information to good use. Next slide. The urban water cycle is something you're all familiar with, I'm sure. Rain in clouds forms as condensation, drops down to earth and impacts the soil. In the soil, some of it goes all the way down into groundwater. Some stops in the soil burden that's over the groundwater. But eventually all of this either runs off or goes through groundwater and ends up in our streams and rivers, or maybe in our basements. Once it gets into streams and rivers, it evaporates, goes back to clouds, and through various environmental factors such as temperature and relative humidity and pressure gradients, it turns back into rainfall. Next slide, please. Now, some basic water science is that, as Ed Murtaugh, who narrated the video, mentioned, water does not obey property boundaries. It also doesn't obey state and federal regulations, but water obeys the laws of physics. So we have to look at water through the lens of science and particularly physics to understand what it does. Urban water cycles are unique and complex. They are different than the water cycles in agricultural areas, different than the water cycles in coastal areas. And in fact, almost every city has a unique, and they are always complicated, water cycle of its own. Again, as you've heard many times already, uphill rainfall impacts downhill properties through surface runoff and/or groundwater. There's no way around that. Water always flows downhill through what we call the gradient. We have two kinds of floods that impact Takoma Park: stream flooding, for example, when Sligo and Long Branch flood, and then also just general flooding when storm drains fill and water rises. According to the Public Works Department, as of October 2020, the city had 546.9 acres of impervious surface. That means surface that does not permit rainfall to infiltrate into the soil. And about 82% of that is untreated, and only 65% of it is subject to stormwater management fees. Next slide, please. Now, that we can also have a unique water cycle in your home. So if we look at things focusing on your property, for example, here the rain comes down. Again, it can either become surface water, which can flow in directly into your basements, or it can go down into the soil, where it can infiltrate through the basement wall. Ultimately, it can go down into groundwater. Now, some of this in groundwater will go up through the roots of trees and be released back into the atmosphere through something called evapotranspiration. But some of this just ends up at the water table, where it starts to exert pressure that we call hydrostatic pressure up on your basement foundation. What this does is this can cause leaking walls and floor joints, wet basement walls, and in fact, even a flood in your basement, as I have been periodically subject to in my home here in North Tacoma. Next slide, please. Again, you've already seen these pictures, so I'm not going to dwell on them, but on the left, we see the overbank flooding from Sligo Creek, And on the right, we see urban drainage flooding on Poplar Avenue. Next slide, please. Where you live is important, and it's also important to remember we are all connected. On the left, you see a slide that represents the Sligo Creek watershed. Sligo Creek basically starts somewhere in Wheaton and ends somewhere in Prince George's County, near Hyattsville, where it flows into the Northwest Branch. What we see in Sligo Creek as we walk around the trail in Takoma Park has water that started in Wheaton, got added to by water in Silver Spring. We add our water to it, and then it flows down into Prince George's County. So all of this is connected, and we need to understand the larger sub-watershed rather than just our own particular problems. Even in Takoma Park, as you see in the map on the right, which is from the Department of Public Works, we have different sub-watersheds, all of which have their own characteristics, and all of which, however, can be impacted from outside the city limits. For example, Silver Spring, the District of Columbia, and Prince George's County all have impacts on our stormwater in Takoma Park. Next slide, please. Now, as we've mentioned, and as the mayor reinforced it, the stormwater is the responsibility of the city council and city staff here. However, it really needs robust community input to be able to plan for the next stages of how to manage stormwater. Because of this, it needs strategic policies and planning that have to go over and above the compliance with water pollution regulations and the focus on city-owned stormwater, which is our current focus in Takoma Park. Also, it really needs to be coordinated with property owners and surrounding communities. Next slide. Now, what will flooding look like in Takoma Park in the future? We've seen Takoma Park as it exists today, but what about in the future and the effects of climate change that we're talking about? Next slide. So we use predictive modeling actually to look into the future. That is really not me in that crystal ball, but we do look into the future and we try to figure out as best as we can what the impact of all these things will be. The figure on the right is a prediction that was taken from the Intergovernmental Report Panel on Climate Change from the United Nations. And what this did is that used various mathematical models with different scenarios to look at the impact of climate change on the global surface temperature, the temperature in the atmosphere. They presented various different scenarios here. The scenario that's in yellow and orange toward the bottom is that we have the same amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that we have today. And this goes all the way up to kind of the worst case, which is the one at the red up at the top, which shows what happens if we basically do nothing and continue to grow with our greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. Here's a little quote I took from the Environmental Defense Fund, who I support is doing a lot of valuable work on climate change. But the physics behind all of this is really fairly simple. As more evaporation leads to more moisture in the atmosphere, the rainfall intensifies. For example, as Dr. Rocco points out, we now know that the rainfall from Hurricane Harvey was 15% more intense and 3 times more likely to occur due to human-induced climate change. So we expect to see a higher frequency of Category 4 and 5 storms also as temperatures continue to rise. And I should point out that the effect of climate change on storms is not only on water, but also on wind. We are going to be seeing more wind, and I think we already have been seeing more wind and more strong wind, again, as an effect of climate change. And the last, Dr. Rocco points out, the clouds that can dump a lot of rain are more common in a water atmosphere. Next slide, please. This slide I got from the UK's Meteorological Office, and I think it graphically shows how warming causes greater rainfall. On the left-hand side of the slide, we see the natural climate without human influence. Warm, moist air rises to form clouds, and then that falls as rain, a little bit of rain. And then on the right-hand side, we see what happens with climate change. We have a warmer atmosphere, we have more moisture up there. And in fact, for every 1 degree C, which is about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, more the air warms, it can hold 7% more water. That's a lot more water. And this heavier rain then leads to the risk of flash flooding and stream flooding. Next slide. And other sets of modeling tools that we can use predict the effect of all this on stormwater management. There are many tools that are used for stormwater management. Often we put these on a spectrum of green to gray, green being something like a beautiful mature oak tree, and then gray, on the other hand, being something that's made of concrete. All these tools are really necessary in order to manage stormwater, and all plus innovative solutions still on the engineering drawing board will be needed in the future. However, the mathematical modeling that we can use, not just to predict additional rainfall, we can also look at the effects on stormwater management. Next slide. So how much rain does Takoma Park get in a big storm? We get really amazing amounts of rain when you think about it. I'm focusing here on the 10-year storm, which is a storm that has a probability of 10% occurring in any given year or once in a 10-year period. Our 10-year storm, according to the guidance document that the state puts out, is 4.6 inches. This results in a whopping 164 million gallons of water on Takoma Park, and that equates to about 248 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So if you can envision that, that's a lot of water. The storm that we had in September 2020, which I'm sure most of you remember, and that we also have been discussing a lot in this presentation, was about that amount. It also was 248 Olympic swimming pools, only 1/10 of an inch below the 10-year storm. The biggest storm that we had in the past 10 years was in July of 2017, when we had 5.73 inches of rain. That again came up to a whopping 315 Olympic swimming pools, 280 million gallons of water that fell on Takoma Park and ultimately will end up in Sligo Creek. Next slide, please. So that's what has been happening in the past. What will happen in the future? Well, fortunately, there have been several studies now that have looked at this. And these studies I have listed under the scenario column here. One was conducted by Montgomery County by the consulting firm AECOM. This is a countywide study that included Takoma Park. The next one was conducted by the Maryland Department of the Environment using the data from the RAND Corporation. This is a study that's being used by the state to develop new regulatory structures for managing stormwater. Then there were two studies that were conducted by different organizations on behalf of Takoma Park. One from the George Mason University, a doctoral candidate, as I mentioned, and one from civil engineering students at Drexel University, my alma mater, just as an aside. These studies all use different assumptions and different modeling methods. However, they all predicted big increases in our 10-year storm in Takoma Park. These increases, depending upon the modeling scenario and which ones are more probable, all range from 13 additional million gallons for a storm and 97 million gallons from a single storm, which of course is a lot more swimming pools. So we can expect in the future a significant amount of additional rain to be falling on Takoma Park. Next slide, please. Our infrastructure as it exists now cannot handle additional rainfall due to climate change. These are areas along the Sligo Creek Stream Valley, Long Branch Stream Valley, where the former Brashears Run and the former Tacoma Branch are particularly vulnerable to additional flooding. We will need new and innovative solutions in order to manage this. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned, the Maryland state programs are taking a deep, hard look at this. The program is called A-Storm, clever little acronym that they've come up with. But as part of the state's programs, they really want people to get involved. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing this. The state guidance statement says that the city, as other cities, should initiate a robust campaign to listen to community resilience needs, provide climate change education, and support individual resilience and build support for adaptation. So some of the things that we can do here in Takoma Park that would respond to the state's proposed regulations and guidelines are to develop a watershed management plan. This is especially important for access to grant funding, so we don't have to pay for everything. That may and should emphasize emergency preparedness and emergency response. This is not merely a public works issue or a rainfall issue. This is really an emergency preparedness response. People can do die, become injured, and lose property due to these storms. The state intends to capture more rain to increase design store by rainfall requirements by about 10%, and maybe shorten the rainfall duration that they use for design from 24 hours to 6 hours. Also to look at studies of 100-year urban flooding. Right now, the emphasis is on stream flooding and not the type of urban flooding that occurs through problems with water just building up in valleys. This will also all need new infrastructure, replacement of old infrastructure, and really innovative approaches. As I mentioned, some approaches that are still on the engineering drawing board and we haven't even seen yet. Next slide.
Thank you, Paul. We're going to begin with Steve Whitney now. He will be explaining the stormwater survey that we carried out recently.
Hey, good afternoon. I'm Steve Whitney. I've lived in Takoma Park for about 30 years and have been involved in watershed management activities for some time. And also as a property owner, not here in Takoma Park, but in Washington, D.C., dealing with stormwater problems on the property due to city work in adjacent roadways, which created flooding on our property. And we had to be very innovative about how to deal with that. The Stormwater Survey actually came as an idea first by people in the Poplar Avenue neighborhood and by another group in the Long Branch Sligo neighborhood. David Reed and Jim Della Giacomo directly gave us the questionnaires that had been used earlier by the Poplar Avenue neighborhood. Those were very focused surveys. We decided to try as a sort of proof of concept to see if we could do it on a citywide basis. It's really kind of a seat of the pants effort. Nobody is an expert in surveys. Nobody was an expert in hosting this, but we did get help from Lori Welch, who is involved with this professionally and did give us a platform to collect this on the web. We were only able to perform the survey on the web, which we think probably limited the response because some people just don't have web access, are not used to it. But we thought we would just do what we could. And so could I have the next slide, please? And we ran it for 2 months, December of last year until January of this year. We ran it on the website. And as I said earlier, pilots were done in Takoma Park. Could I have the next slide, please? And our goals were really to find out what kind of experience Takoma Park residents had with stormwater damage. It was not an opinion poll. We did not expect it to produce definitive results for the city. We just wanted to see just kind of look where the general pain points are. And we also asked people to provide suggestions about how the city might help with the problems and the costs that they had experienced These excellent suggestions were provided to us in text form and not easy to represent in numerical means. And I think a thorough report on that would really take pretty much the whole time of this presentation. However, we have a fantastic database of ideas that we hope we can mine in the future. Next slide, please. Much to our great glee, we got a great response. We got 290 responses. However, we only had 252 city addresses because in some cases, 2 people in the same household responded. And we also got some submissions from people bordering Takoma Park, but these people were not in the Takoma Park list of stormwater fee payers. So we figured they were not really in Takoma Park. I'll explain the color coding when we get to the next slide. And I just wanted to point out on this slide that the majority of our responses were from Ward 1, 2, and 3. We're not exactly sure why that is. 4, 5, and 6 did not respond. Do they not have problems? Did their listservs not send out the announcement of the survey? We really don't know. And that's another area that we feel like requires additional work. But let's go on to the next slide. And I just picked out Ward 2 to show you how interesting the results can be. Now, if you look at the color coding on the right side, the burgundy, orange, and yellow represents pretty high costs that people have incurred. In fact, these costs in the top category went way north of 20,000. Often in the category of 40 to 50,000. So these areas are areas, these residents are sites that have really experienced some pretty serious damage. And we'll give you numbers later on, but just what you can use with a mapping tool is very helpful. You can see the density of damage. The gray are either people who did not choose to report the costs that they had spent, or were very low, and we thought $1,000 or less was not a major expense, because that could have been over 5 years. It was hard to say. But anyway, you can see if you look at the Poplar Avenue Valley, there's just a high density of people in the yellow, orange, and burgundy, and that's a valley. And valleys are where you get the concentration. We were also interested to see that there was some very high density of costs below Spring Park, and then further down in the what's called kind of the Hell's Bottom area. And we know that all of the damaged properties are not reported. This is, like I said, a kind of proof of concept that capturing data from individual residences and putting them into some kind of mapping tool. For example, the city has a geographical information system where this data would be very nice to include as a kind of, I'd say, incident management process. An incident being people who have experienced a huge amount of damage because of stormwater. And then it'll also tell you other things. For example, look at Ethan Allen Avenue up at the top. The co-op is over there on the left, that blue spot. Almost no damage along Ethan Allen. For some reason, one house has had a lot of damage, but Ethan Allen is on a ridge. It's high ground. And where we're going to see the damage is going to be in a watershed in the lower areas. And that is borne out by the data that we're getting. Could I have the next slide, please? This is just to give a spread of costs that people have incurred. And there's a lot of people with, like I said, 20,000 and a long way north of that. This is not a complete representation of the costs. It was interesting. A number of respondents who did not report costs cited expensive repair works on their house, for example, foundation work, but they left the cost blank. I think they just didn't want to report it for one reason or another. But we did get 80%, 84% of the respondents, and you can see that the costs are significant. These this presentation will all be available online. I don't want to spend a lot of time on these details, but it'll be here. So let's just go to the next slide. I think in terms of perception, it's very important to look at the fact that only 38 of 186 people who responded have felt like they have succeeded in repairing and resolving their problems. That's only 1 in 5. And look at the amount of money people have spent. 52% say their problems are getting worse. I think this is some of the most valuable information of the survey. This is how people feel, even without watching Paul's presentation on what I would say the bad news of rainfall modeling. It's going to get worse. Could I have the next slide? Let's get some specific information on the damage that people have experienced. Obviously, property in the basement is going to be top. Nuisance standing water is more than just a nuisance. It's a great place for mosquitoes to breed. It also spoils. One of the reasons that people move into a place like Takoma Park, they want to be outside. Try to be outside in a backyard that has standing water. It is no fun. I have experienced this in some properties that we have. Soil erosion, that contributes to our problem of meeting state water quality standards. It also erodes the topsoil from our properties, and it's probably one of the issues that has led to the loss of trees. 45% of the respondents said that loss of trees has occurred on their property. So if we want to protect the tree canopy, we really have to be thinking about managing our stormwater. The foundation damage is 25% of the people. Foundation damage is very expensive, house settling too. Could I have the next slide, please? This was one of the biggest sources of surprise for us. Where is the water coming from? 47% of the people said it was from uphill properties. That is most of the time a neighbor's property, but sometimes it is a street. It could be a commercial property. It can be public land. The response of rainfall on our own property, again, is a perception issue. It's not an engineering decision, because as Paul pointed out, the water that we experience at a particular place in the watershed can come from under what they call subterranean flow. It will usually occur with a time lag. In other words, you get an intense rain, and that water will show up on your property maybe 8 hours, maybe a day later, because it's come through the groundwater. So when people say rainfall on my own property, it could also, in many cases, be from uphill. It just didn't come across the surface. Takoma Park is legendary for its underground springs. We had 8 people cite that as a problem. And then overflow from street and sidewalk, it surprised me that that was such a small number. But the only thing I can say is that when water overflows from the street or sidewalk, as you saw in the video, it can be absolutely devastating. It can be huge, huge, huge amounts of water because the street is concentrating the rainfall. So although it's a small number, it's one that I think is very important. Could I have the next slide, please? Our conclusions were just that the past damage has been significant and it's ongoing. It's been going on for a long time. A lot of these people reported problems that date back more than 5 years. Residents have spent a lot of money on it. And there's, I'd say, a very high level of insecurity and frustration already, even without knowing about the stormwater models for the future. We think the city should pay attention to the burdens borne by individual homeowners. The suggestions by homeowners are just too numerous to go into detail on, but they do cover a lot of things that people have addressed in the questions here. For example, consultation from I don't know, some source to help people make decisions on what they might do, increase storm drain capacity, control the deer population, provide education, incentives for residents to install stormwater mitigations on their property. but that is going to be covered in greater detail in a future webinar. Thank you very much for your attention. Please put any questions in the chat. Next slide, please. And the stormwater and the survey results will be on the TSS website. And we've taken out all the address and name data because we told people that the results would be protected from personal information. And so there's a de-identified set of data on the TSS website. And we hope you'll take a look at it. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. We're now going to turn it over to Bern Kelly to help us understand flooding that has occurred, past and present, and how that reveals our vulnerabilities in the future.
Thank you, Phil. Good day, everybody. My name is Bern Kelly. I'm a Maryland licensed landscape architect and a qualified environmental planner. Over my 40-year career, I've worked with civil engineers and site and environmental planning, and also with surveyors and construction firms. As a landscape architect, in 2018, I took an additional certification in green infrastructure maintenance. Currently, my small business, the Greenfields Company, is qualified to do work within the Rainscapes program in Montgomery County, River Smart Homes of Washington, D.C., and the Rain Check program of Prince George's County. I moved here in 1983, and I bought my house just outside the city's municipal boundaries in Pinecrest, also known as Hell's Bottom, which was just mentioned, in 1989. In 1992, I convinced the city to expand the city limits to Eastern and New Hampshire avenues and helped to create the Circle Woods Community Association and the preservation of the Circle Woods. I have suffered through 3 major flooding events where combined sewage and water have erupted through my drains and infiltrated the doors of my residence. I had to hire an attorney to take on WSSC to double the pipes in Circle and Cockrell Avenue and enlarge the box culverts in 4th Avenues. It did help. Next slide, please. We use a website. We're asking in the chat. We use this website for information that Paul brought up, the 477 properties, which represents in our zip code from flood factor, that's 9% of all properties have a greater chance of being severely affected. 26% have a chance of being severely affected, and that's 9%. Also, in addition to damage on the properties, flooding can cause cut off from access to utilities, emergency services, transportation, and may impact the overall well-being of an area. You could have your property value go down because you're in a flood zone, and not to mention the safety and other factors. Next slide, please. This is a map from Flood Factor that people were asking about. I've got an echo. As you can see, most of the severe flooding is shown in red, and the extreme flooding, shown in the darker maroon, occurs in every ward throughout the city. The greater concentration of the most valuable properties is on the western state line with the District of Columbia and in the southeast borders. With Flood Factor, you yourself can go on and just put your address in, and instantaneously you will get information relative to flooding that you either may or may not want. And going back to what Steve said about fewer responses, well, you can tell that the western side of our city has a lot more red and orange and maroon in it than the east, but there's still pockets everywhere throughout the city. Next slide, please. This is a blow up of the mapping areas of moderate flooding in light blue and severe flooding in purple. Deep purple takes on a different meaning than it did in the late 60s. The areas of concern are almost all of Brashear's Run, Mississippi Avenue, Baltimore and Piney Branch, Boston and Philadelphia, Cedar and Birch, Willow and Maple. And on the convergence of them, you can see at the tentacles there, the branches come together, and just where it's just past where it's and under Brashear's Run on the slide, that's where the new library is proposed to go in the floodplain, where the city hall already has a moat in the floodplain, and where Piney Branch are all susceptible to severe flooding. Next slide, please. This is the blow up of the Tacoma branch headwaters. Now, most of you have been down to Forest Park or Spring Park. They are lovely places, and the water is coming right out of the ground. We have very high water table, but we also have these incised valleys. And one that many of you may not know about is what used to be a valley coming down from the Tacoma Metro. That's over in DC, is the headwaters of Brashears Run. And down here in the bottom of the slide, you see Slocum Run, and that is from Fort Slocum. That water is coming down from the top of where, Blair and Kansas intersect by that school there. That water is coming underground, but it's also flowing right down Kansas Avenue. And that's what we call a pretty long fetch in the sailing world, when you've got water running a long distance. And there it is. It hits the end of Kansas Lane, goes diagonally down through the bottom of Westmoreland and the bottom of Allegheny, and a bunch of houses on, as you're about to see, are on 4th Avenue, are very much, it's imperative that we get some remediation in that area. Then you have the Westmoreland Valley, where during the flood of the storm in September 10, 2020, there was a water rescue to get a FedEx driver out of his van right on 2nd Avenue between Allegheny and Westmoreland, right down from where my wife's house is on 6517 Westmoreland. And I was motivated to go out because I knew my property on 307 was going to be flooding. So you can see the Poplar Valley there and the Westmoreland Valley, they merge right there at the WSSC lot on the corner of Cockrell and Circle and Kansas. And the Poplar Valley and the Westmoreland Valleys, there's streams that used to run, and they're behind the houses mostly, and they're in small pipes. In Poplar Valley, there's only a 24-inch pipe. It's way undersized, and I'll speak to that, what we can do about things like that. And the last tributary there you see, many people on the bottom of Elm and Prince George's know this well, a lot of water comes down through that beautiful forest, Forest Park, and down Prince George's Avenue. So we have severe flooding at the end of the Circle Avenue on both ends, the 300 block and the 400 block. And you probably have noticed some ponding, whether you're upstream or downstream, on your properties. Next slide, please. Here is the FEMA map from 1997. And the Slocum and Westmoreland tributaries are down at the bottom, and the middle is the Westmoreland, and the Poplar is on the top right. Now that blue is the flood, and the green is what we'll call the 50-foot buffer for when you're doing floodplain mapping and planning, as that's part of the work we do when we lay out subdivisions, roads, and houses in my field. That goes all the way up to Spring Park to the intersection of Elm, just below the intersection of Elm. And we have a photo coming up of during that flood. Next slide, please. So that black van you saw in the video in the beginning, that's me driving around. And I wanted to see everywhere where the flood is. And on the left there in that picture, that's the storm drain. And I'm not sure exactly what's bubbling out of it, but that's next to Spring Park in Poplar Avenue. So I drove around from up to the ridge at the junction, right? The ridge is Ethan Allen and Carroll Avenues. And we're on the south side of that ridge, and we're in what's called a sub-drainage area. And I mapped and went to all of those red lines to see where flooding was occurring. And I also noted where there was green space. And I also note where there's opportunities. And, it's clear that we have a problem, and it's going to take both the property owners with the support and investment of the city government to define the areas, which our survey is trying to do, where we can attenuate and hold floodwaters as well as where the problems are. We have to use parking lots and open space to do what's called attenuation ponds, where you have a release, you have a catch and a release within 72 hours. 48 is what the rain gardens are designed for. And I've designed some of these, and you can all go up to Gusini Shoes, which is closed on New Hampshire Avenue. And that parking lot has what the new requirements are is what we call a sump or a catchment that's planted. It was never maintained, so it's all overgrown with invasive species, unfortunately. But it does function as a way to attenuate or capture the water and hold it, but not we don't really want to hold the water completely because our streams need the replenishment, as Tina Snyder mentioned in the chat. So we have to take this as a holistic process with the private and public partnerships and creating these locations, identifying these locations. Let's get incentives for people with personal property to offer to have some capture systems put onto their properties, like the Rainscapes program. And let's create a way to get more credit than currently being proposed in the program for people who, we're all in this together. So everyone should be able to get benefit and rewarded through less stormwater tax if they participate in a public-private program, which we're looking forward to because it's a clear and present danger. Thank you very much.
Hi, this is Paul again. I'm coming here now for our conclusions. Before I go over these, though, I want to acknowledge some people who you haven't seen or even heard who contributed materially to this presentation. First, I'd like to, from Tacoma Stormwater Solutions, Suzanne Lowen, who has been really our manager and outreach coordinator, and Rob Valenti, who putting together this incredible stormwater PowerPoint presentation with a bunch of people who do many things but don't do PowerPoint presentations. Also, David Reed, Chris Beck, and Randy Gibson were intimately involved in preparing a lot of the material for Tacoma Stormwater Solutions. From the Friends of Sligo Creek, Ed Murtaugh did the video, and he's the voice-over of the video. And we would also like to thank Michael Wilpers for putting the article in the Friends of Sligo Creek newsletter. So with those acknowledgements, now here's what we would like to see as Tacoma Stormwater Solutions. First, we would like the city to immediately start to develop a strategic watershed study or stormwater management plan. As Philip told you at the beginning, we submitted a framework for this to the city in December of last year, and we are very eager to be working with the city to try to bring this to fruition. We believe that this can be done without the expenditure of a large amount of funds on consultants in order just to take advantage of everything that we have learned in the city. We also think the city needs to engage community to take advantage of resident expertise and encourage participatory science. It's amazing. My experience with the Friends of Sligo Creek has shown me how amazing it is, the number of people who come out for it to take measurements of water quality, to clean up the creek, to pull invasive species. People really want to be involved in the science. The Stormwater Board of the city should really take the active role that's described for it in the city charter to prepare for the state's forthcoming A-storm requirements and other adaptation requirements. These are things that will transcend all different departments in the city: public works, emergency preparedness, housing and community development, all have a role. And the Stormwater Board needs to develop the policies for the coordination of these various city staff activities. The Stormwater should also develop policies to facilitate public-private approaches like payment for environmental services, which is something, again, you can read about more on our website. And finally, all of you, residents, business owners, need to get involved. Join us at Tacoma Stormwater Solutions. Join the Friends of Sligo Creek and get active in Friends of Sligo Creek stormwater and water quality issues, and communicate with the Stormwater Board members on our city council. Phil, I'm going to turn things back to you.
Thanks, Paul, and all our presenters. We've accumulated quite a number of questions, which I pulled from the chat. Some of these are directed to our city staff. I'm not sure that we necessarily asked them to participate in that role, but if any of them want to step forward and answer those, please let me know. I'm just wondering, just kind of if someone could explain the payment for environmental services concept. Steve, is that something you can do?
We do
could-
have David Reed on the call, who wrote
Oh,
the article.
David, are you willing to answer that, David?
I would absolutely yield to David, who is a very eloquent spokesman for this approach.
Certainly. Or give it a try. Survey involves parties stream and parties.
David, your sound is poor.
Parties
Maybe
upstream and
turn
downstream.
off your video.
We're not hearing you very well, David.
Any better now?
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. A payment for environmental service arrangement involves the transfer of resources, both private and public, to create mutually beneficial environmental outcomes. Very often parties are uphill and do not actually experience much environmental damage, and parties downhill who really experience the damage. And a payment for environmental service relationship brings those parties together, oftentimes such that the downhill parties will make financial transfers or payments to parties uphill, and thereby establish and install all those mechanisms that are needed to prevent the flooding and the damage downhill. Just in a nutshell, it is a transfer of resources. Absolutely critical to the success of payment for environmental services is the involvement of the public, that's to say, the government, who is often needed to help with technical studies, to help underwrite some of the costs that are being absorbed by the people damaged downhill. These payment for environmental service relationships have been used around the world at huge scales. The whole watershed, for instance, of New York City is under a PES, payment for environmental service arrangement, such that the city pays farmers hundreds of miles upstream, such that they do not put fertilizers and other contaminants into the water that is consumed and used by residents in New York City. So in a thumbnail, basically, that's what a payment for environmental services is. And we've translated that through a publication you can find on Tacoma Stormwater Solutions into a 4-page document, but translated this right down into Takoma Park and right down into the level of our work.
Thank you, David. So Daryl's indicated she's willing to field some questions. I think she answered one already in the chat about who's responsible for maintaining the Flower Avenue green streets, and she's basically said the city is. Maybe I can start with an easy one for you, Daryl. Why is Takoma Park not eligible for the Montgomery County Rainwater or Rain Garden rebate?
Thanks. Very much enjoyed the presentation today, and thank you all for your efforts. I think in the interest of time, I'd like to direct folks to the city's stormwater webpage. We have a FAQ there that goes into any question that we've ever had about our stormwater fee system, how it's set up, why it's set up, and what it covers. So if you don't see an answer or hear an answer from me today, that would be a good place to look to find it. In regards to why the city properties aren't eligible for the county rainscapes program, it's because the city residents don't pay into the county stormwater program. They pay into the city stormwater fee. We have our own separate stormwater utility, and the city is responsible through the council and staff to generate the revenue from that fee, set the fee structure, and then we as staff program the use of those funds. Historically, the city has used those stormwater funds generated from the stormwater fee for public projects and for maintenance of our stormwater infrastructure and new projects and meeting the state's treatment requirements. So we haven't focused on private property uses through a rebate type program. In order to move in that direction, we would have to identify a source of funding to provide those monies for private property use. We do have a small program with tree planting where the city's through the bulk buy program the city offers trees at a reduced rate, which are certainly a component of stormwater. But for things like creating a bioretention or green roof or permeable paver, we don't have the program that that the county has established. This issue has come up from time to time, and the city council oversees and makes the decisions regarding that. So happy to talk further offline with anyone. And again, I just would refer you to that FAQ for a more detailed response.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to combine two more and throw them at you, and then maybe we'll turn to some of the other speakers, the questions that address them. But the two questions are there plans to replace existing underground storm drain pipes to increase capacity to prevent future runoff water backups? And the second, which may be related, what can be done to prevent Sligo Creek from overflowing in the future onto Sligo Creek Parkway?
That first one, we do have annual plans for system maintenance. We have a 5-year capital program that does some of our major project plans, but in terms of the actual inlets and pipes, you may or may not be aware that, as the mayor mentioned, we do a video pipe inspection of our system on a rotating basis. Through every 5 years, we get to all the inlets and pipes video feed as well as cleaning. So that identifies for us pipes that are cracking or in distress, or inlets that are needing to be repaired or replaced. So that kind of provides our information for our repair list. But in addition to that, we do develop plans for addition of inlets, adding structures, and expanding pipe size. One of the challenges in areas like Takoma Park that's so well developed and has such intensive infrastructure is we share that underground space with the gas company, the electric company, the water company, with water and sewer. So locations for expanding pipe size can be more and more of a challenge. But we do have included those in projects over the course of the years, and have additional projects planned for that. This year we'll be working on a project on Cockrell Avenue where we'll be adding 400 feet of new pipe to address a situation now with conveyance of stormwater that really impacts Spring Avenue. And so we'll be trying to address that. The project that we finished earlier in the year on Sycamore Avenue didn't expand pipe size, but did add inlets and additional capacity so that we could capture more water in those flash flood events. So we do plan for that in our program capacity analysis and restoration work. The second question was, how do we stop Sligo Creek from flooding? That's a much bigger question, and one that I'm probably not qualified to answer. If you take a look at a map, I mean, all water comes from upstream. So the solution to the capacity and flooding issue in Sligo Creek is a problem that all of Montgomery County feeds into to some degree. So the watershed is where you really have to look to identify how we're going to improve not only water quality, but reduce the amount of increasing impervious surface that generates a lot of that additional floodwaters.
Thank you. And I see that, if you just bear with me, there's one more that I think is in your bailiwick, Darrell, which is knowing that stormwater management is a problem in the city, why are stormwater management waivers still being granted by the city to new construction projects? I can't judge the accuracy of that, but.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any waivers that the city has ever issued. As you may know, when you do construction projects in the city, we're mandated by the state to have a stormwater permitting project process, and the parameters of the stormwater permit, the treatment requirements are all dictated by the state. So our program has to be reviewed and approved by the state. So we have a fully certified program in that regard. The state requires waivers as an option basically people would have to prove a hardship that they can't meet the city requirements. My understanding is we've never issued a waiver in the history of our stormwater permitting process. So I will certainly touch back with our city engineer to see if I'm incorrect in that regard, but I'm not aware of any waiver ever issued.
Okay, Phil, I would like to just jump in a little bit.
Sure.
No way am I supported with or paid by the city, but I pay pretty close attention to what's going on with stormwater permits around here. I am also not aware of any waivers. And I believe that the city does a good job of enforcing the state guidelines and requirements. I have a lot of problems with those requirements and particularly for the future, but I haven't seen any indications that the city has actually dropped the ball on fulfilling the state mandated requirements.
Yeah, and as you've mentioned, Paul, there is a plan in place. The state is working to strengthen the rainfall requirements and the manual guidance by which we're directed. So there is a process underway for making improvements to that.
So thank you very much for joining us and answering. Question for Steve. On the survey, were respondents asked about damages from mold?
Yes, they were. And I didn't address that because it's not really a storm. It doesn't fall into the stormwater management arena directly, but they were asked, and mold was like wet basements, right at the top of the list of the impacts of stormwater. I really felt like I was a little constrained on time, so I did not address it, but the answer is yes, and mold is a very big issue.
Okay. Maybe this is for Bern. Can we see a map of properties that are at risk for flooding?
Yes, absolutely. We put there at the end, I don't know if we can have that slide back with the 3 links, but floodfactor.com, a company called First Street, has created a magnificent tool. And as I said during my presentation, you can just enter your address and you'll get a lot of information. And then there's, links that they have where you can get even more information. It's fascinating reading. I would hope that everybody take a look at it, because as we mentioned in our presentation, it's not just the people who are in the colors orange, red, and magenta, maroon, who are suffering or part of the problem. We are actually the ones receiving, my property included, tons and tons, gallons and gallons, swimming pools of water. And you up above also have high water tables in your groundwater and have wet basements. I mean, everybody knows how many springs, especially Daryl, how many springs there are coming to our sidewalks and just throughout the town. So we're all connected by the water, and no one's exempt. But you can find out more at floodfactor.com. It's a fantastic website. That's where I borrowed the maps. And I know that GIS, it would be nice to have access to a public GIS view ArcInfo. And I saw that Al Carr put up some links in the chat about Google locations. But also Daryl and FAQ, the website is quite helpful in information. Thank you.
Okay, 2 questions that I think are related from Armand. What are some methods to manage stormwater? Where can we learn more? And then from David, how do lawns contribute to stormwater relative to areas planted as conservation landscape or with trees?
I could probably answer those.
Bern, you want to take that?
Sure. Well, the second one about lawns, David Blockstein asked, when you're calculating stormwater runoff, there's coefficients of runoff, and you have high and low coefficients. The lawns, grass is a cool weather crop. So in the spring and in the fall, they're actively growing and they're absorbing more water. But as you all know, if you play out in the fields, in the summer, they turn into dust bowls and they're hard as a rock. I mean, the ground is almost just like pavement. So the coefficient runoff from grass is variable, but but it's much higher or faster coefficient runoff. We do conservation landscaping as part of the programs I'm in, and that turns, and they reward you for getting rid of your grass. And you know, I have a little mantra, kiss your grass goodbye, and put in conservation landscaping. And I think that more people can do that, and everybody who's into gardening, and boy, what a spring we're having for the plants. The plants are very happy. The dogs were happy in COVID. The plants are happy this spring. But the other question, remind me how it went. It was Bill, the first question.
Oh, sorry. What are some methods to manage stormwater? Where can we learn more?
Right. Well, the Rainscapes program in Montgomery County, because we are in Montgomery County, we do pay taxes to Montgomery County, and we don't get all of the benefits of Montgomery County, but the Rainscapes .gov at the Department of Environmental Resources, I think it is, or what are we here? Department of Environmental, whatever it is, this county has just put in your search Rainscapes program Montgomery County, and you will get as much information as you could ever possibly need or want. And if our listeners are in Prince George's, they have a program under Rain Check called Prince George. And by the way, the one in DC and the one in Prince George's, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation is aligned with the one in Prince George's, and the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay works with the River Smart Homes program. Only Montgomery County has an exclusive independent program.
Thank you, Bern. Let me see. I think I have a question that maybe Tina, are you still here? Can you explain your 6-hour retention question?
Oh, hi, everybody. It wasn't really a question. It was more of a comment on what I had seen in one of the slides. And it was a request to reduce retention to 6 hours. And right now it's 24 or 36 because the slow discharge into the streams keeps our stream banks stable and reduces the surges to the streams, which really helps reduce that impact on the streams. So reducing the retention to 6 hours in say a 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 inch storm event, which we'll be getting in the future more frequently, would be devastating to our aquatic life. So I was just saying that I wanted to mention that I don't think that should be a request, and that will require stormwater management facilities to be larger on site, but they will help our aquatic systems much more.
Hi, Tina. Let me respond to that. There was more to that slide that my editors cut out in interest of brevity, but I think there's a misunderstanding here. What the state is proposing is using a 6-hour storm rather than a 24-hour storm, not calling for the additional retention from that storm. So it's merely a matter of looking at the fact that storms are more intense and concentrated in a shorter period of time. They were looking at a 2-hour storm and a few others. The 6-hour is not a final, but it's an idea they've been kicking around. Everything else you said, I wholeheartedly agree with you. And I don't think that is the state's intent when they're talking about the 6-hour storm.
Sounds like a horse of a different color and a little misunderstanding there. No one.
Yeah.
We want longer retention times.
Yeah, can I also just ask a real quick question about the stormwater treatment? I've heard people say that Takoma Park has met all of its treatments requirements, but you could meet a treatment requirement of 1.6 inch storm, but that doesn't mean that, you know, the county actually has a higher storm rate, 2.6 inches of storm treatment. And with these larger storms, meeting a requirement of 1.6 inches of storm in a 1-hour storm event really doesn't do much when we get 2 and 3 and 4 inch storms. So I think that it would be great for Takoma Park to meet a higher requirement in terms of their treatment, the quantity that they treat. So anyway, that's a comment, a thought.
Can I just respond? Because I think there too, we have a misunderstanding in the concepts that we're talking about. The city has a NPDES discharge permit, which is a federal requirement. Any jurisdiction that manages its own stormwater program has to have a permit for that discharge. And part of the requirements that the state passes on to any permit holder is, including municipalities, is that we have to develop a program. And this was started in 2007, I believe. By 2025, every jurisdiction had to develop a program and put in place measures to provide treatment to untreated impervious surfaces equivalent to 20% of the impervious areas. So the city, as all other jurisdictions, has been working on that as part of our mandate and permit requirement. And we produce an annual report. Again, those reports are available on the city's stormwater webpage. And as of the 21 report, we have met that 20%, in fact, slightly exceeded that 20% treatment requirement based on the stormwater management facilities that we have in place and programs like our stream restoration projects and stormwater pipe cleaning. So that was the 20% mandate, meeting that requirement that was being referred to, not the treatment requirement of a stormwater construction permit. So apples and oranges.
You know, I think people need to realize that in the United States, our water quality regulatory complex is extremely complicated. I mean, not to coin a pun, but things flow down from EPA to the states, then things flow down from the states to the municipalities. Many of these things are really not designed to address the specific problems that municipalities have. But because of this very complex top-down construct, it seems to work this way. We certainly have not controlled all water pollution, and none of these regulations are really designed to do that. I certainly invite people to join the Water Watchdogs program through Friends of Sligo Creek and report pollution and untreated discharges when you see them. That way we can get the attention of the city and the county and try to control more water pollution as it happens.
I have a very general question left, and maybe my co-leaders here can make sure I didn't overlook any, but can we get consultations on improving water handling on individual properties or groups of properties? How can that happen?
I think you need to contact the professionals in the field, the landscape architects, the civil engineers. The county does have a list of people who they have approved. That's certainly not something that this group is going to do, and really it's not the city's responsibility, but there are a lot of people like Byrne here who are qualified to do that.
All right, so we're pretty close to the end. Unless there are any urgent last questions, I'm going to suggest we wrap up. I thank everybody for their contributions today and for Daryl's willingness to answer questions, and our council members who have stayed with us through this. And I think Kate stayed for most of it. Byrne?
Yes, I just want to mention, and Daryl, right, you have a presentation tomorrow night at City Council meeting on stormwater. Did I see that in an agenda somewhere?
I don't know how much of a presentation it'll be. Always happy to talk more, but usually get less time. But I believe the council is set to do the first reading ordinance, budget ordinance, for both the general fund as well as stormwater. And so the mayor had asked me, since not much had been talked about during the budget review process, just to give a little overview of the FY23 stormwater budget. So I've got a couple of pages planned that I'll present, or at least have available in writing. So that'll be accessible on the city's council agenda webpage after the meeting. So happy to have people take a look at that.
And one more thing, Daryl, did you not also have something new on the website regarding the stormwater fee?
Oh, thanks, Byrne. Yeah, and if you guys, I think you guys are doing a follow-up. I'm so happy to provide some information relative to that next presentation, but as you know, the city has a stormwater utility fee. The council authorized a change in the fee structure last year after a study that the city had put together in 2018. So one of the additional aspects once we got the new funding structure was to enable people to apply for a credit if they had taken actions on their own properties to reduce stormwater. So that credit program is now created and available, and it is on the city's stormwater management website. So if you have a green roof, bioretention facility, rain garden, dry well, permeable surfaces, beginning for this next cycle of the utility fee structure, you can apply to have a consideration for a credit, which can reduce up to 50% of your stormwater utility fee based on the amount of impervious area that's being treated and the capacity of the measurement. So that application form and document and guidance is now available on the city's website.
Again, thank you, everybody. We're going to wrap this up. Look for posting of the recording on the TacomaSolutions.net website, as well as the announcement when we have a date for the next webinar on solutions. Thanks, everybody.